Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to go through the books that I read across January, I was about to say November, who knows what month it is anymore, in January 2022. And I had quite a good reading month, even though I sort of at times was like, oh, I haven't really read in a few days, but I think I had quite a lot of audiobooks on the go, quite a lot of quite short books, and just sort of, yeah, wanted to talk about them. I'm going to split this over two because there are quite a few books, and I feel like that maybe makes more sense. But let's get started. So I started off the year, the first read of the year was The Story of Work, and this book is quite a broad-reaching book by Jan Lucassen, and this basically looks at work as a sort of a history of work through history. A history of work through history. I'm really great at words and stuff. I can do that. Yeah, so this is a book that is all about how we have viewed work and how it's continued to develop over time. So taking you through, for example, the move from, you know, people just doing tasks to survive to trading that work for money, and then to kind of where we're up to now in terms of, you know, sort of a capitalist model, sort of work, certain bits of work and how we sort of perceive it and what the future of that might be. So I did enjoy it overall. I think maybe it could have been a little bit shorter. It's quite long. And I also just sort of thought at times it was sort of like, I don't know, I kind of wanted sort of little interjections or sort of more focused periods on certain parts of time. But overall, I thought this was really interesting, clearly very well researched, and just a very, very interesting book. Next, I read Break the Internet by Olivia Yallop, and this was really quite fun. I sort of had read most of it just at the end of 2021, but just sort of finished it just in the new year. And this is a book sort of all about influencer and social media culture, and particularly how it all kind of ties together, how it sort of developed, what the kinds of history of it are. And I thought this was really well done, because again, it can be very, I realize I always say this, and I maybe I've just been burned before, but I feel like I've read too many think pieces where people are like, social media and the internet is all really bad. It's just lots of narcissistic people doing blah, blah, blah. Whereas I think this book is quite clever at unpicking what social media and influencer culture is like and how it looks at sort of specific stages. So the fact that people, you know, the sort of super high up influencers, what that does not only to their sense of reality and their sense of self-worth and what have you, but also just the kind of complicated relationship between them and brands and privacy and various other things. And I thought this book handled this quite cleverly, and so I was really glad to see it. And I followed it up soon after by reading a little book by Annie Ernaux, Simple Passion, which I thought was really quite beautiful. It's Annie Ernaux talking about a sort of relationship or affair or something like that, with this man, and how it kind of goes through almost its sort of seasons. You know, there are periods where they've been sort of really close, and now that, you know, we sort of start the book with them being a bit distant from each other, and it's Annie Ernaux sort of reflecting over it all, and sort of having a really deep think about how it's all tied together. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and really great to see how that was my first Annie Ernaux, and I'm going to be reading a lot more of it for the Fitzgerald in February anyhow. So look forward to all of those. We're going to be reading The Years by Annie Ernaux, and then I'm going to be reading a lot of her other books that I've got, that have sort of slowly been accumulating from library reservations over time. So yeah, we'll go with those. I also wanted to quickly say at this point, I meant to mention a little bit at the beginning, but I'm debating whether with these sort of wrap-ups, whether it works better to do them as weekly wrap-ups or as monthly ones. I'm entirely easy either way with them, but I realise that my monthly wrap-ups end up being sort of somewhere in the ballpark of about 23 or whatever to about 30 books, and that's quite a lot for even split over 2 videos. That's quite a lot of me just being like, this book and then this book and also maybe this book. So I was wondering whether I should switch to weekly ones. I don't know if anyone has any preference. whatever. If you'd rather see them as weekly ones, please do let me know. If you'd like me to stay doing monthly ones, all good. Maybe some kind of combination of the two, don't know how that would work, but maybe something like that. Anyway, on to the rest of the books. So I also read quite a few arcs this month, so advanced copies of books, and one of them was Tides by Sara Freeman, or Sara Freeman, I think it might be, and I thought this was such a beautiful, haunting story. It's relatively short, but it tells the story of this woman who essentially just leaves her family behind and sort of goes a bit on the not on the run, it's not really the right word. She sort of goes and lives this other life elsewhere, and she sort of becomes quite kind of like the tides in the title, kind of flows in and out. She sort of does everything by her own rhythm, and I thought it was so interesting because she just keeps on having these moments where she kind of knows that she should be going back, but she doesn't. Or she kind of feels that she should be doing something else, and then she kind of doesn't. And it's so interesting because so often we see stories like this sort of almost a bit more from a male perspective, right? Of sort of the idea of a sort of man riding out into the outback and doing it, you know, going on this big adventure and leaving family at home. And it's so interesting to see a woman's perspective on this, and this woman, particularly how she kind of articulates it and kind of addresses it. And how, you know, she's just sort of reached these absolute limits. And I thought the writing on this was beautiful. I thought it was just such an interesting book. And I believe it comes out in early February as well, so please do give it a little look in. I think it's a really beautiful little book. Some other advanced copies that I read in January were Write It All Down by Cathy Rensenbrink. So I read her book Dear Reader last year, which I really loved. I just thought it was such a gorgeous, generous and kind of joyous book of, and all the other words ending with OUS, book about readers and the joy of reading. And Write It All Down is a sort of almost a kind of guide or how-to for budding writers to just how they can go and write their stories, particularly stories that involve their personal lives. And I thought what is just so nice about Cathy Rensenbrink's writing for me is there's just this like I was saying, there's a real generosity, like there's this real warmth of spirit that she is just excited that you could be writing and excited to share what she knows about the world. And it's not this kind of very dry like thing with really cliched writing tips. It's a lot of how she approaches it herself, how she thinks through the writing process, and various other bits. And I just thought this was a really well done little book. And just really, yeah, it made me sort of instantly be like, right, I need to get up tomorrow morning and set some time for me to do some writing. Admittedly, I was also in peak dissertation mode, so I was like, I know that's not going to happen, but I might revisit this book once that's all handed in very soon, and get moving with that. But yeah, really, really exciting nonetheless. Another advanced copy I read this month was Christos Tsiolkas's book, and I think I'm mispronouncing his surname there, 7½. And this is a really quite interesting little story, kind of in some ways similar to a video I put out recently about Edmund White's latest novel, which does this really quite clever thing of inserting the author into the story. And this book very much feels like Christos is himself a character in this book. It's kind of auto-fiction, it's sort of memoir. He at one point creates this idea of a film that he wants to make using a porn star who he really loves as the main character, sort of playing him and like playing other sort of roles. It's a really bizarre little book at times, but I thought it was quite fun. It was just really inventive and clever. I mean, it didn't always work for me overall, but I think generally, I think this book at least reaches for something quite exciting, and I really appreciated how it brings in ideas of queer desire and sexuality and family and lots of other discussions sort of all in the mix, to kind of create this sort of auto-fiction memoir thing, but that I found very, very convincing and interesting nonetheless. And just after it, I read another advanced copy, which was Love Marriage by Monica Ali. And I think, like Tsiolkas's book, this book also comes out in early February. I adored her previous book, Brick Lane. I thought Brick Lane was so well done, and Love Marriage I also found really interesting, just for this kind of bizarre set of characters, or not even that bizarre, but kind of quirky, fun set of characters within a family, all trying to navigate various parts of kind of clashes of cultures and things around religion and marriage and various other things, but actually at the heart of it, this is just really enjoyable as a book. And I think I'd kind of said to myself that I wanted to read a few more books for pleasure this year, and admittedly this had a sort of a deadline attached to it because it was an advance copy, but I just really enjoyed just getting lost in the story and really enjoying the sort of silly, sarcastic voices from various characters within it. And I think it does then go a lot deeper than it seems at first. I don't want to spoil any parts of that, but this book does a lot with bringing in kind of silliness and fun, but also some very, very serious themes at the same time. Next up, I read a few other sort of fiction books sort of dotted around that I had been meaning to read for a while, and a couple of non-fiction as well. So I read Jigsaw by Sybille Bedford, and this was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in the 80s, and is a sort of, again, auto-fiction book where it details this young woman who sort of discovers her sexuality whilst also sort of within this sort of these kind of constraints of everything going around her. She travels around bits of Europe and various other things. And again, this is sort of linked to Edmund White in some ways. An interview with that Eric Carl Anderson over at Lonesome Reader did with Edmund White a while ago, spoke about how Edmund White, when he was on the Booker judging panel, pushed to have this book be shortlisted to kind of get another queer voice onto the shortlist. I will say this book didn't really work for me. I think part of that I will also attribute to me being a little bit sleepy as I read parts of it. I know I do say that on some books, but you know, sometimes you need a kind of proper run-up of a book. I think I should have started the book, realised that I wasn't fully awake for it, and then restarted it a bit later. I didn't. I kind of ploughed through, and that maybe was a mistake. But also, I don't know, I think I found that it didn't always get to where it needed to. For me, I think maybe I don't know. I think maybe my expectations are too high around it, kind of having queer content, because it's relatively minor in the book. But I think I just found that there were lots of descriptions about family members and places that I know some people would love and really treasure and really sort of luxuriate in. And for me, I was a bit like, you know, this is kind of interesting and everything, but I kind of wasn't fully into it. And I think it's difficult if you're not fully into a world of a book when suddenly there are lots of descriptions about said world and you're like, I don't really care. But overall, you know, it's still a really interesting book, and I'm glad I read it, but just not one of my new favourites, essentially. But I also read Empire of Pain, which I really, really enjoyed. This is a book that had a lot of love last year. This book by Patrick Radden, Keefe, and it talks about the Sackler family in the US, who were this sort of business family who got involved in pharmaceuticals, and particularly around pain relief medication, and particularly quite strong pain relief, and that these were drugs that many people then became really heavily addicted to. And much of what the US, I mean, this is a problem in other countries as well, but the US especially has a real problem with addiction cases around this, in a way that has been really quite damaging to certain communities, where whole communities and neighborhoods have just been really blighted by this, because of the sort of the knock-on effects of, you know, if people can't get the medication they need, and it's the difference between them being in extreme pain and you know not, then people will potentially, you know, resort to crime or whatever to kind of fund that and support that. And so it's a really difficult book in many ways to read, for the kind of content, but it's dealt with so interestingly and playfully that, well, playfully is not the right word, but it's clearly very well researched, but also very, very well written, and it stops it from being like a litany of crimes against the Sackler family, and instead is this really nuanced portrait of what's happening in the industry, what's happening with the Sackler family, what's happening in the US and globally, and I think it was just really well done. It won the Bailey Gifford Prize, I believe, and was a very, very deserved winner in my opinion. Because this is how I think a lot of non-fiction should be approached, of how can you create how can you cover all the main material and almost make it feel like a novel, because the narrative was so strong in this book. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Next up, I read a few non-fiction books that all kind of unintentionally were connected to nature. So one of these was The Outrun by Amy Liptrot. I'm kind of getting ready for her new book to come out, I believe in April. But The Outrun is a book that I'd had recommended to me a bit before and was really keen to check out. And essentially, Amy Liptrot is a sort of writer dealing with the after effects of her addiction to alcohol. And in the meantime, she sort of moved to this small island in the Orkneys, sort of around Scotland, to kind of heal and recover a little bit, but also to find a sense of community. And in the meantime, she's sort of really enchanted by the nature of the place, and really intrigued by the kind of the community of people and all those sorts of things, and observing birds and that. And I just thought this was such a beautiful book. It just, especially the audiobook, I really recommend to just let the words wash over you. She sort of describes these beautiful vistas and sort of areas of nature and sort of these birds. And I just really enjoyed this. On a similar note, I read Earthshot, which is a sort of selection of writings around nature, and particularly around global conservation. It's the Earthshot Prize is being established. It's not a book prize, don't worry for once. The Earthshot Prize is sort of for innovations around nature, and particularly around fighting climate change and fighting kind of various sort of problems within the environment. And this book then is quite interesting for kind of going over it. I did sort of, part of me did feel like it didn't always go in as much depth as I'd want. Partly maybe I've been spoiled by some really good nature books last year from the Wainwright Prize. But I thought it did a really good job of talking about the sort of, you know, various parts of the problem, and then sort of trying to make a case for why we should be taking it a lot more seriously. So that was interesting itself. And I also read Derek Jarman's Chroma, and this is a book I talk about in a little bit more detail in my Derek Jarman video. But essentially, Derek Jarman, kind of queer activist, artist, writer, gardener, everything. He, in his sort of, just as he was starting to fall really ill from AIDS-related complications, he started to lose his sight, and in the process he started writing this book all about colour. And obviously him as an artist, he has a lot to say about it, and it has all these sort of little musings of kind of tracing colour through history, and all these really quite beautiful and fascinating things, how we use colour in various sayings and things like that. And as you get towards the end of the book, he talks about black as the final colour, as he is losing his sight almost entirely. And it's really heartbreaking and really beautifully done. But there's just this gorgeous way that he'll weave in something about colours and something about nature, and then will hit you right in the gut with something about his HIV treatment, and how it's not working, and how his health is failing. And then he'll go back to nature and colours and tints and hues and everything. It's beautiful, and I just thought it was just such a stunning and clever type of book. I don't think I've read anything quite like this before. Next up, I read a few more advanced copies of books. So I read Manywhere, which is a selection of stories by Morgan Thomas. And this book I thought was really clever for many ways. It's just very queer short stories, very fun, very silly at times, very dark at other times, but all very authentic. The first story of this collection blew me away. Even, I mean, the story aside, it was a great story, but blew me away, especially with the writing and the focus of that writing in such a clever way. And I sometimes struggle with short story collections. I really do at times, because I think I find it hard to get the narrative of it all, or to kind of find how they all connect. And sometimes it's a bit jarring, because I either read one short story a day or have a big break between them to kind of separate out the narratives, or I read them all in one go, or many of them in sort of back to back, which is also jarring for different reasons. So I always struggle to work out how how I and short stories can kind of find a good way to be, but this was a particularly good one, I thought, as was another selection of short stories I read this month, Walk the Blue Fields by Claire Keegan. And so I read Claire's, I can't do words today. I read Claire Keegan's book, Small Things Like These, which I have somewhere around near me, and just destroying my room in the process. I read Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These, which I loved. It was one of my top books of last year, and so really, really exciting to read Walk the Blue Fields by her, which has a lot of those same sort of themes of kind of talking a lot about belonging and Ireland and religion and many other things, but again is also with that really beautiful voice that she has, this way of capturing characters through very, very few words. So I really enjoyed this, and around the same time also read some more advanced copies. So I read Violets by Alex Hyde. This is a book that a lot of people have been talking about, and I was really excited to get hold of as an advanced copy. It comes out in February, so it'll be out roughly around the same time as this video. Sort of a little peek behind the curtains here that I record these a couple of days in advance. And this book is really fun for having these two different women called Violet, and it basically sort of just their lives, sort of this dual narrative, just sort of going through as they deal with the war, as they deal with many other things around them. And I thought it was so clever in how it integrated them, because at times I forgot that I was reading two different Violets because their stories mesh and overlap in such interesting ways. But the difficulty is then also because they mesh so much, sometimes it can get a bit confusing. Overall, I mean, a stunning book, really, really well done. I would not be surprised if this starts sort of hoovering up a few sort of prize shortlists this year. It's just a very nice book, really well done historical fiction, looking at, you know, these two women going through the war, and particularly one who really wants a child and can't have them, and the other who has a child but cannot keep them. And the book deals with those two Violets very, very well, and I think was just a really beautiful little read. Next, I read a book that I've been meaning to read for the absolute longest time. I say longest time, it's only been out for about a year, but like it was one of those books that I knew that I'd like. I got it out from the library and then had to give it back because I ran out of time. I did the same on Libby. I just kept on not reading it. Ghost in the Throat by Doireann ní Ghríofa, I believe the name is. I mispronounced that. But I actually made a little note to myself at one point as I was listening to the audiobook of how she says it, which is Doireann ní Ghríofa. I mean, I've still probably massively mispronounced it there. But anyway, onto the book. So A Ghost in the Throat is a sort of, it's this sort of, again, almost auto-fiction, but it's meant to, in theory, be a biography or linked to it. And it is this woman, as she goes through and looks at the life of a famous poet, whose name I will also not try to pronounce. But as she's sort of trying to understand this Irish poet's work in Gaelic and kind of understand the meaning of it and translate it, she also sort of discovers quite a lot about herself. It's, as much as this book is about, you know, this poet and about poetry and art more generally, it's also about motherhood and the Gaelic language and so many other things, and jaw-droppingly written. Like, this is some of the finest writing I've seen in a very long time. It's like sentence by sentence, this book is just remarkable. She just has turns of phrase that are incredibly startling and really powerful because of how unexpected they are. And you know, I have a soft spot for Irish writers anyway and the Irish accent, so hearing an audiobook of this book was kind of perfect. But just her ability to kind of frame and scope out these whole giant conversations and then also bring them down to the smallest domestic level, I just think it's mind-blowing. And I see now why people were so desperate to recommend this to other people, because I just think it's that good, and I just really loved it. Next up, two more advanced copies. Animal Bodies on Death, Desire and Other Difficulties by Suzanne Roberts. And this is a book that it completely was not what I expected, but I really enjoyed. So it is a non-fiction book talking about the link between death, desire, being an animal, or sort of having animal natures, being very human, all of those sorts of things. And yet, in the meantime, it brings out a lot of really detailed discussions about death and shame and vulnerability and so many other things. It is a deeply personal book. At times, this feels like how to describe it almost. At times this feels almost too personal and too vulnerable, and it feels like you're reading someone's diary, and it's kind of almost uncomfortable. But then you realise, you know, she's really chosen to share these stories, and that's the important part of this book, that it has that vulnerability and that kind of power to it. But yeah, not an easy read in some ways, but I think weirdly entertaining despite the content, the kind of subject matter. It's very well done, and I was really interestingly, that's not the right word, Bob. I was pleasantly surprised, that's the phrase, by it all, and I thought it was just done very, very well. I am getting to the end, I apologise. Devotion by Hannah Kent I read next, which is another advanced copy. And this is beautiful. This is a really stunning story, I thought. It's kind of told almost at the beginning in this kind of very like fable, sort of folklore kind of way. And it is a story of this young girl in sort of olden days Germany, and she is sort of, you know, it's this small village, everyone knows each other, it's very religious, the kind of everyone's based, and then there's this one character who is basically a witch, or is believed to be a witch or have magic powers, and again it's that kind of fear of the outsider thing, you know, but without spoiling too much, lots comes up in this book around you know, what that magic or may not be, and particularly a growing sense of sexuality from this young girl, and she and this other girl form this beautiful relationship, and then their lives are sort of separated, and again I don't want to spoil this bit, but they're separated in some ways, and the book suddenly gets really interesting and spiritual, in a way that I wasn't sure if I'd necessarily like at first, but because it has that sort of folklore feel to it, it actually completely worked for me. I just thought it was so clever, because it feels like a massive folklore, you know, sort of folk tale or fable or something like that. It feels very Hans Christian Andersen or kind of Brothers Grimm, and I just thought this is really well done. I kind of want to do a separate video on it just because I loved it so much and really want to talk about it. It's great. Please do check it out. It's very queer and very folky and everything, and I loved it. It's great. Next up, I read another short piece of non-fiction. This is Alicia Facts' How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division, which is just basically one essay talking, sort of one like 100-page roughly essay with her talking about political divisions and how parts of the world are sort of falling apart, and her sort of thinking on it. And it's just such an interesting book to read, just because she is so insightful and so clever, and her writing is always like what I've always enjoyed from the now 3 books that I've read of hers, is there's this real warmth that comes through in her tone. She is hopeful, she always remains hopeful that there's something that can be done, but she does not shy away from acknowledging the real harshness of the situation that everybody's in. And I think that's really brave as a book, and I really enjoyed this a lot. I thought it was very clever. And then just to cap off this one, before I split this into a second video, I also just wanted to talk about a little audiobook I listened to, which was Dave Grohl's The Storyteller. And as someone who loves Nirvana and the Foo Fighters, I was really excited to hear Dave Grohl tell his story himself. He's always referred to as sort of like the nicest man in rock, and that really comes through with this, where you're like, he's just a nice guy. He's a bit of a nerd, he's a bit of a dork, he's this nice dad who like looks after his kids and loves them, like, but also just like goes and makes music on the side. And like it's a gorgeous book, because it does really go into a lot of detail about him as a person, his history sort of pre-Nirvana, and then what that was all like. And it's just, I think I do get the audiobook partly because it's Dave Grohl narrating it, and he's just fun anyway to hear, but also he does like little musical interludes on the audiobook that I thought were really fun, just to kind of hear like the, you know, the band sort of jamming in the background. So yeah, just a nice, good, fun audiobook of him talking about his life. Anyway, I'm going to pause that one there for now, before I go on to the second part of this, just to split it up, because otherwise this could get very long. I've been Bob, the booker, and I hope you are enjoying your reading. I hope you've had a good reading month in January, and I hope February is an even better one for you. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.